Welcome, everybody. We're going to keep the room open and just let folks join us for a few minutes. But thank you for being here. For those of you who just hopped on, welcome. We're going to be starting in a moment or so. We're just giving people time to join us. So thank you. It seems like we're getting to the point where attendees are leveling off. Blake and Rachel, do we want to get started? Great.
Sure.
So welcome everybody to our webinar on language access planning. We're so excited to have you here today. We're going to have Blake start us off. And just thank you for being here.
All right, thanks, Mia. So good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the OBS VAP Training Center webinar, Creating Trauma-Informed Language Access Services. I'm Blake Cush. I'm the Training and Outreach Unit Chief at OBS. Our director, Elizabeth Cronin, can't be here today, but she definitely sends her welcome and appreciate you joining us today. I'm just going to cover a little bit of housekeeping, turn it back over to Mia. So today's webinar is a part of a series of webinars that we offer through the OBS Training and Technical Assistance Request Program, which you're actually going to learn a little more about in just a minute from our TARP providers at the CUNY Institute for State and Local Governance. Mia's going to talk all about it, and they're a great team to hear from. And for the last few years, we've actually hosted a series of webinars designed to help you tackle some unique challenges and pressing issues that you and your programs you work for might be facing. And we're kind of hoping today's no different. We hope to get the most out of the training from Cannon today, who's awesome. You're going to love him. And should you want to go back or revisit what was covered, today's webinar is being recorded. And it'll be published on our YouTube channel, usually within a few days, 3 to 4 at the max. But you'll get an email about that with the link as well. In addition, links to this training, other trainings, previous ones we've done in the series, they're also available on the OBS VAP training webpage and the OBS YouTube channel. Again, all links we'll share with you so you have access to it. And finally, this is a pitch we give at all of our webinars. As soon as you exit, you'll be directed to an evaluation survey. You might even have access to a QR code for it. Please take a couple minutes to give us your feedback. It's incredibly valuable. It helps us make real-time improvements from webinar to webinar, training to training. That feedback is incredibly valuable, and we just really appreciate it if you can take 5 minutes just to share what went well, what can be improved. And we also give it to our guest speakers and presenters so that they have access to it as well, so they can improve future trainings they might do elsewhere. So with that said, I'm actually going to turn things back over to Mia.
Thank you, Blake. So yeah, I'm going to get us started with just a quick overview of the program that brought us all here today. So getting right into that now, this webinar is offered to you through the Training and Technical Assistance Request Program. It's called TARP. And through TARP, we offer this webinar series. We've had a few this year, and we also offer individualized training and technical assistance request program. This program, TARP, is offered by OBS, and we at the CUNY Institute for State and Local Governance provide this training, these webinars. I'm Mia, I use she, her pronouns, and I'm a policy analyst at ISLG. So just a quick start before we pass it to Cannon for the real bulk of this training. We want to inform you all a little bit about what TARP is, and that's because we have really great services that we want you all to utilize. So TARP matches victim assistance providers with expert consultants who provide individualized custom TTA to you all. So that TTA can be on a whole array of strategic and organizational topics, anything from trauma-informed supervision to strategic planning to grant writing. We really offer it all. And to work on those trainings, we connect you to either someone in-house at ISLG who has expertise or to a consultant. We have a whole consortium of consultants who provide expertise in areas we don't have. And we work hard to match you to the right consultant for your target population, your need, your geographic area, whatever that may be. And all of this is at no cost to you all. It's completely free and really valuable. We hear really great things about the trainings that people receive through TARP. So we want to just pitch that to you all. We've included here just a list of example trainings that we can offer, TTA topics we can offer. We do have a whole catalog on the OBS website. We'll provide links to all that, and they're also included in this PowerPoint. But you'll see here we have strategic planning, developing talent within. We do a lot of supervision, professional development work. And so we just encourage you all to take a look at that catalog. And to receive these services, it's very easy. It's really a two-step process. Either a program director or an executive director at your organization goes onto our catalog, selects a topic that they would like TTA in, and then submits a submission form or a request form. And again, if you have a TTA need at your organization that doesn't fall within our catalog, we have this other option of saying, other TTA need, select that, submit a form, we'll see what we can do. So yeah, with that, I'll pass it to Cannon. We're really excited to introduce Cannon here today to talk to us about a really important issue. So I'll pass it to you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Mia. And once again, I just want to highlight OVS has been incredible to work with, and just the resources that they provide to you. I definitely encourage you to take advantage of them, particularly because it doesn't cost you anything. And frequently we encounter, when I do the work, we encounter cost as a barrier. And so for the state of New York and OVS to prioritize access to the incredible TTA that they have at their fingertips, I really encourage you to take advantage of it. So today, we are going to be talking about language access, and let me make sure. Okay, do you see the slides? I managed to mess this up frequently. So we're going to be talking about trauma-informed language access. And what I want to just kind of let people know is when we're talking about language access trauma-informed, I may be saying some things that could potentially be triggering because we talk, our business is victim services, right? And how we communicate things, how things are communicated. We use slang, we use expletives. The things that our clients, victims and survivors come to us when they're seeking assistance, they have experienced violence, they have experienced trauma. It could be domestic violence, it could be sexual violence, physical violence, verbal violence, stalking. There's just it's a huge range of potential crimes and traumas that our clients are coming to us with. And with tied to that is the importance of ensuring that we have the ability to hear the stories that our clients are coming to us with. And so once again, I will be using slang, I will be using expletives to highlight some of the challenges that come up and the things that we need to be thinking about when we're talking about creating trauma-informed language accessible services. Just really quick background on myself. So I've been working on civil rights and language access for over 20 years. As part of the Interpretation Technical Assistance Resource Center, we are funded by the Office on Violence Against Women, the Office for Victims of Crime, and the Department of Health and Human Services to provide technical assistance on training on anything related to language access. And that goes from what compliance looks like, language access planning, training people on how to effectively work with interpreters, and also training interpreters, both on how to do the skill of interpretation, but also providing training for interpreters on being trauma informed and how to effectively interpret for survivors and victims of crime. So hopefully when you walk away from this is that you'll understand what the requirements are for Title VI as it relates to language access. Describe 2 to 3 considerations when working with survivors with limited English proficiency to ensure trauma-informed practices and to identify resources to help improve your language access plans. And so I'm going over a lot of information today, and the expectation is that you won't become experts right off the bat after 90 minutes. Each one of these areas is actually a training in and of itself, but what we wanted to do is set the groundwork and to have everybody at the baseline so you understand what you're required to do under the federal law and some of the considerations we want you to be thinking about so that as you're either updating or developing your compliance plan, your language access plans, you're making sure that you're including resources to that are from a trauma-informed approach. So really quick, just if you wouldn't mind, just in the chat, just letting us know if your organization currently has a language access plan. So, that's a yes or a no, or I don't know. And, as you're putting your responses into the chat, I'll just continue talking. So why we're talking about language access. And so the reason why language access became important to me and I realized the importance of the issue was so a long time ago when I was a practicing attorney, I used to represent individuals who were placed on an involuntary psychiatric hold in California. So in California, somebody can be placed on an involuntary psychiatric hold based on the fact that they've been assessed and they are a danger to themselves, a danger to others, or they can't
Shannon,
provide.
excuse me 1 second. I'm so
Sure.
sorry to interrupt. We know that some people are having some chat access issues, and we are
Okay.
going to work on getting that for them.
Okay.
So stay tuned and keep going, Cannon. Just know that that chat will hopefully be able to fix those permissions. Bear with us.
Okay, great, no worries. So in California, they can be placed on involuntary psychiatric hold, and then they're placed in a locked psychiatric unit. And at the locked psychiatric unit, the treating psychiatrist can petition the court to hold that person for 14 days. They can also file a petition, and in California, it's called a Reese petition, where they get permission from the court to forcibly medicate an individual who is refusing treatment, right? So my job was to represent individuals in the hospital who wanted to leave or who wanted to contest the petition to forcibly medicate them. And so this was a very typical case for me. So I arrived on scene, and what happened was, and I looked at the file, and 911 was called. The husband reported that his wife was not taking her medications and that he was concerned for her safety and the safety of their children. So on the police report that was part of the file, officers arrived on scene. They interviewed the husband and the parents. And based on that, they placed her, they checked the box that said danger to self, danger to others, right? Specifically danger to her children. And then they took her to the psychiatric unit where the psychiatrist placed her on the 72-hour hold and admitted her, right? And so that psychiatrist quoted the police report and diagnosed her as paranoid schizophrenic catatonic. The psychiatrist, the treating psychiatrist, in reviewing and petitioning for the 14-day hold and the petition to forcibly medicate her, he quoted the police report, the admitting psychiatrist report, and diagnosed her as paranoid schizophrenic catatonic non-responsive refusing medication. And so in looking at the file, and this was a very typical file for me, right? She's catatonic, she's not going to talk to me. And honestly, I was thinking, well, it's going to be an early lunch for me because she's catatonic. But I realized, well, I noticed that her name, it was a Korean name, right? And as we're working together, you'll quickly learn my Korean is terrible, but I do know how to say hello. And so I walked up to her. I said, well, I'll just give it a shot. I'm not expecting any kind of response. And I walked up to her and I said to her in Korean, hi, I'm your attorney. The hospital wants to keep you here and give you medication. If you don't want to stay in the hospital, you can't talk to a judge today. And she looked at me, she said, yeah, I don't want to be here anymore. I want to talk to the judge. So obviously not catatonic. She just didn't speak English, right? Obviously the hearing didn't happen. The hospital wasn't able to actually talk to her. And at one point I was able to find a bilingual Korean social worker who was fluent in Korean. The social worker arrived to the hospital, spoke to the woman for less than 5 minutes and looked at me and said, I'll be right back. Walked to the nurse's station, walked back and asked her, will you take this? And the woman said, yes, I'll take that. That's my medication. Right. So the whole time, nobody tried to speak to her in a language that she could effectively communicate or understand. She was refusing medication because the hospital didn't take the time to figure out what her medication was, right? And if somebody offered me pills, I wouldn't take it unless I knew what it was, right? What we found out later was that her husband and her in-laws, the 3 English-speaking people who actually spoke to law enforcement, who everybody was basing their information, everybody was basing their decisions on the information that those 3 English speakers provided. What they had done is they had withheld her medication to send her into a psychiatric crisis so that they could call the police and have her arrested. Right. And so when we're thinking about language access, it's not just the importance and the impact that it has on how we are providing services to victims and survivors. What I want you to also consider is all the multiple systems that our clients, that victims and survivors are constantly encountering, right? And consider the first time anyone tried to communicate with them in a language that they could actually communicate in effectively in is when they come to you and they're talking to you. We rely on information for all the work that we do, and consider all the multiple systems, whether it's the criminal justice system, law enforcement, 911, child protective services, mental health, hospitals, court decisions. Is there, a restraining or protective order out? Have there been incidences at school? Whatever the case may be, we collect information because we want to know, understand the facts and how best to proceed and how best to assist our clients, right? What do we do when nobody in the multiple systems that we are working with, that our clients are encountering, no one took the time to actually talk to them and made decisions about our client based on information that isn't valid or true, right? So when we're talking about language access, I also want you all to consider not just thinking about what we're doing in the immediate, because I have somebody that speaks Korean and they're asking me for help. How am I providing trauma-informed access? But consider all the multiple systems that they're encountering. So if you do a request for records and you get a report and it's from Child Protective Services because something happened, or there's a restraining order that has been placed against our client, to ask our client, to ask the victim and survivor, hey, when you encountered, I've got a police report. When you encountered and you saw the police and the police arrived, did they have an interpreter there? Was there an officer that spoke your language? Because we have to take into consideration the accuracy of the information that we are getting. And we have to consider that it may not be accurate, and it's going to have an impact on our clients. And so remember, for us, doing all the right things is asking questions, right? And making sure that the information that is out there, the information that we're receiving, that's being shared with other agencies, is actually true. And for individuals with limited English proficiency, they constantly face those barriers to access. And things are written. And once it's on paper, once I get a file and once I see it's on paper, I assume it's true. And for me, what I think about is, I know enough Korean, but I think about all of those other clients that I encountered that were diagnosed as catatonic, where I didn't speak a language, that they may have spoken. And I took it on faith that they were catatonic. And when I walked up to them and I said, hi, I'm a lawyer, it didn't mean anything to them. I'm just another voice in a very scary place that's not trying to help them. in the way that they need help. So really take into consideration the breadth and scope of the barriers that our clients face and to ask those questions, because if there is information on our client that's incorrect, then we need to be taking steps to correct them. So why are we here and what are we required to do? So the basis for why we have to provide language access is based on Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. And so that says no person in the United States shall on the grounds of race, color, or national origin be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance. And so there's case law from the Supreme Court, and the case was Lau v. Nichols. And based on that decision, the Supreme Court, what they said was national origin included language access. And for us, what that means is if you are receiving federal funds or federal financial assistance, then all your programs and activities must be language accessible. If you are receiving federal funds and you are funding other grantees, right? So you are the primary recipient and then you are re-granting those federal funds, your grantees must be providing meaningful language access to all programs, activities, and benefits. And federal funds isn't just money, right? It isn't just a grant that you're writing, it's resources. So if you have a technology grant that paid for computers in your office, that's federal financial assistance. For law enforcement, if you participate in a bulletproof vest program, you know, that's federal financial assistance. You are now subject to Title VI and you have to provide meaningful language access. Meaningful access means language assistance that results in accurate, timely, and effective communication at no cost to the LEP individual. For LEP individuals, meaningful access denotes access that is not significantly restricted, delayed, or inferior as compared to programs or activities provided to English proficient individuals. Right? And so one of the key areas that we frequently encounter is delays. Right? Is it acceptable for you to require your clients to wait 2 or 3 days or a week before you can find an interpreter and they can receive assistance? Generally, no, right? What the Department of Justice is going to look at is what is the level of response and service that you're providing to the English speaker and how closely that matches for LEP individuals. Another thing I like to highlight and discuss about Title VI is it's not just you and your organization and how you're complying, but also in terms of looking at it as a tool that you can use when you're advocating on behalf of your client to address systemic issues or systems-based issues around language access. So Title VI complaints have been successfully filed against courts, prisons, hospitals, and also law enforcement agencies because they weren't complying with Title VI. So it is also having a strong understanding of Title VI and how to use Title VI to advocate on behalf of your clients so other systems are more language accessible. So limited English proficiency, it's evolved, right? So back, what it used to mean, back in the 90s, 80s and 90s was my grandmother. So limited English proficient, I mean, the extent of her English was no English. Like somebody would try to talk to her, she would look at them and say, no English. What we understand now is limited English proficiency means it's the ability to communicate effectively in English for individuals who speak English as a second, third, or fourth language is impacted by the situation, stress, and the subject matter, right? So you have individuals and an example I use is like at a college or university where you have international students, right? They're a computer science major. They may understand computer science, the language of coding, but that's maybe the primary strength of their English speaking ability. So if they understand coding, if they understand just general conversation, they may not understand our legal process and the language that's associated with the criminal and civil court systems and laws, right? So subject matter can have an impact, right? Trauma and stress. Like if you experience some kind of trauma and stress, what language do you fall back and rely on, right? And so thinking about, well, oh, Mia, you have a question?
We do. We have one in the chat,
Sure.
or in the Q&A function. We have, are hospitals required to have interpreters available?
If they are receiving federal funding, then they are required to comply with Title VI and have interpreters available. So one of the things, most likely the hospital system that you're talking about is receiving some kind of federal funding, right? Whether it's Medicare or other resources, right, that they may be tapping into. In addition to that, New York, I believe New York has a state law has requirements around language accessibility for hospitals. So if you are seeing issues around accessibility at hospitals, there are multiple legal avenues that you could pursue. For example, in California, there would be a potential Title VI complaint. And so with Title VI, if you're filing a complaint, you're actually not suing the agency. There isn't an individual right to file a lawsuit under Title VI for language access. What you would do is file a complaint, and the Department of Justice, or in this case, if they're receiving federal funding from the Department of Health and Human Services, their civil rights office would be investigating that. In California, there is state-specific law which would allow for a private cause of action to sue the hospital. So if that's an area that you that is creating issues for you in terms of accessibility, we can follow up and have a conversation about what hospitals you're seeing language access issues and what the correct avenue for advocacy would be. And so once again, thinking about language access, so if you've experienced trauma, right? If somebody is a victim of sexual assault, right? What language would that individual be most comfortable speaking in, but also for us to consider what language would our clients, would the victim or survivor most effectively be able to communicate information to us, right? Because the details are really important. And one of the things that I'm going to continue to highlight is how much information is it okay for you to miss, right? Do you need all the information so you can make a decision as to how best to assist your client and to what resources and assistance you can offer them? Is it ever okay to miss 5% or 3% or 1%? And if it's just 1%, what 1% are you okay missing, right? So remember, it's really important that when we're thinking about language access is that we are making sure that we have all the information that our clients need to share with us. So the qualified interpreter, and so I refer to the Department of Justice a lot because that's the agency that is providing funding for us and most likely to investigate us if we do run into a Title VI complaint. So I use them as a benchmark as to establishing standards. So a qualified interpreter is an interpreter that meets the requirements and standards recommended by the Department of Justice. And the Department of Justice has resources available around qualified interpretation, translation, and language access. But in addition to that, it's established by your department or agency to interpret competently and accurately and ensure your ability to effectively communicate with individuals with limited English proficiency. And so for us, qualified is how we define it based on our needs. A lot of times we look at certification, and certification, so what you'll see frequently, there's court certification, medical certification, administrative hearing certification, conference interpreter certification. So there are a lot of different certifications. But in addition to that, we need to consider what types of crimes that are involved in the clients that we are assisting, right? And we cannot just rely on the certification of the interpreter and take that on faith that they can actually interpret for our clients, right? And so we have to remember that interpreters are people, right? They experience trauma, they experience vicarious trauma. They may not have the language skill or experience to interpret for particular types of crime. They could be perpetrators, they could be victims or survivors, right? And I share this And this is probably the worst case I've ever heard. And this was well over 10 years ago, but it highlights for me the importance for us to be vigilant and to ask questions when we're contracting with interpreters. So in California, this was related to me by another attorney in a rape trial in California. The only people in the trial that spoke the language was the interpreter and the victim. And the certified court interpreter told the victim while she was on the stand preparing to testify, "No wonder you got raped. Look at the way you're dressed." So this is a certified court interpreter. Prior to me hearing this, if I got a certified court interpreter, I was happy because I thought, well, these are the most qualified people, right? And in this particular instance, the district attorney, the victim advocate, and they didn't understand what happened, right? They had prepared the victim to testify and she completely shut down. And it wasn't until later that she disclosed to a different advocate that she had been working with, right? She disclosed that this is what the interpreter said to me, right? So when we're talking about qualified, I encourage you, if you have a plan, to look at what your definition of qualified is. And if you don't have a plan, to ensure that you're incorporating your need and understanding of what qualified is, right? And for us, if we are working with victims of domestic or sexual violence or stalking, right, making sure that our definition of qualified includes interpreters that are able to, without bias, to interpret for victims of domestic violence, sexual violence, or stalking, right? Or if we're talking about, in the multitude of crimes, right, making sure our interpreters have the language and vocabulary necessary to interpret accurately and convey meaning accurately when we are working with them. And just want to highlight, you don't have to do this in a vacuum, right? A lot of agencies are doing this work, have created policies and procedures and standards. And, my job primarily is just to assist programs to create these standards and how best to implement these standards. So the interpreter's role and the interpreter's job. The interpreter's role is to facilitate communication between two or more people who use different languages, being either spoken or signed. The role of the interpreter is to place a non-English speaking participant on an equal footing with those who understand English to the extent reasonably possible. The interpreter's job is to render everything said in the source language into the target language accurately without omitting, adding, embellishing, or summarizing anything spoken or written, right? And so we highlight this because a lot of times people will say, well, just interpret word for word what I'm saying, right? And that's actually not conveying meaning, because we have a lot of idioms and expressions that have no meaning in another language, right? So if I said, hey, don't put all your eggs in one basket, most people that grew up in the United States would understand what I'm saying. But if I said that in another language, it would have no meaning. Or like, it's one of the examples that one of my colleagues shares is, it's raining cats and dogs, right? And they say, if you said it's raining cats and dogs in Spanish to somebody, they would look at you like, they would look at you sideways and quietly walk away from you, right? So we want to make sure, what does that mean? It's raining cats and dogs. It's raining really hard. And that's what the interpreter's job is to process that and then convey the meaning of what is being said. Hi, Mia.
Hi, we've got a few questions, people
Sure.
raising their hand to join us, and then we also have one in the chat, but I think maybe let's start with Stacy. Stacy, you should be able to join us now. You're unmuted. Are you still with us, Stacy? While Stacy joins us again, how about we move to Caroline? Caroline, you should be able to join us now.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, yeah, my question was already answered, so I'm sorry.
No need to apologize. That's good news. We've
Okay.
got another one. Thank you, Caroline. We've got one more. Let's try Candace. Candace, are you here to join us?
I am, but I did not have a question. I did not raise my hand, so I apologize.
That is okay. We're flexible. Then I'll just move to the one in Q&A canon. So there's one we have, how can we verify how qualified an interpreter is, especially on the spot?
Sure. And so one of the things you want to do is ask questions. So ask them if they have any certification, who certifies, and in what language they certified. Asking them in terms of what their experience is relative to the types of cases they worked with. So what other agencies have they interpreted for? What types of cases have they interpreted in? And then I'm going to share with you really quick an exercise that we do. And so this is an interpretation exercise. And this is consecutive interpreting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read about 2 sentences, and I want you all to listen. And then what I would like is if somebody could repeat it back, that would be incredible. But if not, just some feedback on what your impressions of the exercise were. So what I'm going to do right now is I'm just going to read about 2 or 3 sentences, and then we'll get some feedback from all of you. Okay, so here we go. Liability for unauthorized use. If you notice the loss or theft of your credit card or a possible unauthorized use of your card, you should write to us immediately at P.O. Box 3696, Omaha, Nebraska, 68103-0696, or the facsimile number 402-502-6098, or call us at 1-800-688-7070. Okay, so that's one really long sentence. Can anybody recite that back for me? And if not, what are your impressions of that exercise? Was it easy? Was it hard?
In the chat, we have no, cannot repeat it, very wordy. No, 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 no.
Yeah. So the reason why I like this exercise is, and I will say the interpreters that I work with that are that co-facilitate trainings with me could interpret that without any issue, right? But the great thing about this exercise is when you're meeting with that interpreter and you don't quite know if they're qualified, reading them 1 or 2 sentences that's content specific will be able to tell you, oh, wow, this person can interpret or this person can't, right? If they can't do it from English to English, they're not going to be able to do it from English to another language, right? So making sure it's content specific. If you are talking about protection orders or orders of protection, if you're talking about victim rights, right? If this is an assault case, right? An assault case that potentially has that's potentially racially motivated, creating 1 or 2 sentences that is subject specific, and then reading that to your interpreter, right? Because it takes potentially less than 30 seconds, and seeing if your interpreter can repeat it back, right? If your interpreter can't repeat it back, I'm not going to say, no, you don't use that interpreter, right? But what you'll be able to do is you'll be able to use it as a frame of reference. So rather than me reading that whole sentence, would it have been easier if I had read it or spoke like this? Liability for unauthorized use. If you notice the loss or theft of your credit card or a possible unauthorized use, right? So if you're the person that you're working with can track and repeat back information to you after you say only 4 or 5 words, that provides you a framework to how to effectively communicate and use that interpreter, right? So it's a great tool or resource. It's something that you can create on your own if you would like help creating this exercise and making sure that it's contextually is trauma informed and has the information that you want related there, then that's definitely something we can support you with. So when we're talking about trauma and interpreting, right? The linguistic community, including deaf, is a small community, and interpreters know the lives of many members. Not all interpreters are trained and are thoroughly knowledgeable about domestic violence, sexual assault, and trauma-informed practices. Some interpreters are themselves victims or perpetrators. You will need more time, right? Whether they're using consecutive interpreting or they are using simultaneous interpreting, you're going to need more time. Interpreters have privilege of power. They have the status of either being caring or the ability to speak English. In addition to that, victims may specify a gender preference for an interpreter, right? So if somebody has been a victim of an assault, and if their assailant was male, they may be more comfortable with a female interpreter, right? Also, age can have an impact on the comfort level of your client and with the interpreter. So somebody that is an older victim may not be comfortable having a younger interpreter, right? And a lot of times you may not have an option or choice, but you want to be able to plan ahead and identify any potential issues where the interpreter could potentially be a barrier and go over them with your client so you can minimize to the extent that you can any kind of barrier that could be created. Another quick way to check to see if your interpreter may be qualified is to ask them, tell me the difference between interpretation and translation, right? So interpretation is spoken or sign, right? And translation is written. The profession makes a distinction. We as lay people interchangeably use interpretation and translation, but if they can't tell you the difference between interpretation and translation, they have not received training, right? So you're going to want to consider finding another interpreter, but if you can't find another interpreter because time doesn't permit, understanding, okay, this person doesn't have training, so I might take a couple more minutes kind of laying the groundwork and establishing what my expectations are of the interpreter, and understanding I'm going to probably have to go a little slower and make sure that I'm going over the information more carefully. Another way that you can do a quick check, there are 3 modes of interpretation. So simultaneous is what you see at the United Nations or when you see an ASL interpreter that's interpreting. So I'm speaking and the interpreter is interpreting while I am speaking. Consecutive interpretation is what we just did as part of the exercise where I'm speaking, I will speak for maybe about 15, 20 seconds, whatever that is. I will pause and then the interpreter will interpret, right? The third mode is sight translation. And an example of that is if I have a written document, let's say I have a victim statement and it's written in Spanish, what I would have the interpreter do is look at the victim statement and read it. But when they are reading it out loud, they're taking that Spanish written document and reading it out loud into English. So 3 modes of interpretation. Ask your interpreter, can you tell me what the 3 modes of interpretation are? If they can't tell you, they haven't received training. I would reconsider trying to find another interpreter. But if you can't find another interpreter, understanding, okay, this person doesn't have training, so we're gonna pay a little bit more attention to what they're doing. Hi, Mia.
Hi, we've got some contributions. Catherine in the chat shared, it is so important as trauma impacted persons are usually uncomfortable with authority and control. And then we have an anonymous question asking, is Google Translate appropriate?
Google Translate, I would say at this time, it's not appropriate. The technology just isn't there. We just did a training in Kansas, and what a victim advocate related to us a problem that they had with Google Translate. So they were confirming via email to their client a meeting that they were having next week. So it was a sexual assault victim. And so he typed into Google Translate, just confirming our meeting next week. And what Google Translate gave him was just confirming our date next week, right? So the thing about Google Translate technology, any kind of mechanized translation, first, mechanized interpretation or translation is not recognized as meaningful language access by the Department of Justice, just because the technology isn't there accurately. But one of the limitations of the technology is it doesn't understand context, right? Because it doesn't understand context, it's going to make mistakes. And in our case, we can't afford those mistakes, right? So you can imagine like how terrible it would have been if the victim advocate didn't have somebody to catch that mistake, right? And to have a male victim advocate send us a female sexual assault victim, oh, confirming our date next week, right? So we're not in a space yet where we can make those mistakes. Does that mean you don't use Google Translate? If you've got nothing else, it is a way for you to use to identify basic information. Anytime you're in a situation where you're using artificial intelligence or mechanized interpretation or translation, you want to confirm the data or the information that's being provided. So you're going to want somebody that can speak and read and understand the language to confirm the accuracy of what was done. Another thing about this technology is that it's free for a reason, right? They're learning software. What it means by it's a learning software is any data that you input into that system is saved on a server, right? So that means that if it's saved on a server, it's accessible by software engineers or anybody who can get into that system. So I would caution you as if to avoid using that technology where confidential identifying information could be saved onto the server. Hi, Mia.
Hi, we've got a few more questions related to this. Maybe I'll just list them and you can approach them as you'd like. So we've got one, are there reviews or some monitoring of interpreters that occur to minimize instances of inaccurate or incomplete interpretation? Are there any stats related to the effectiveness of interpretation? And then this next one, how would you handle it if you believe the interpreter was not relaying accurate or all information to the victim or to yourself?
Sure. And so as to the first question, it depends on who the certifying or licensing body is. So if you're working with a certified interpreter, the certifying body, so let's say you're working with a certified court interpreter, the state of New York certifies them, and you can actually file complaints if there are issues with how the person is interpreting, right? So there is that process. Let's say you're working with a telephonic interpretation company like LanguageLine. In terms of quality control, what you would want to do is identify interpreters that had that were problems with and report those interpreters to LanguageLine and ask them to address it appropriately. Internally, what policies I encourage you to adopt in terms of quality control is to create essentially a blacklist. So if there are interpreters that you're working with, whether they're for a telephonic interpretation company or they're in-person interpreters, create a list of interpreters that you don't feel like are meeting your needs or standards, right? And include them on the list. And share those with your agency and your colleagues, right? So for telephonic interpretation, the process is the interpreter will call, they'll identify themselves via a number, and then you'll proceed. So for LanguageLine, like you get me, I'm Canon, I'm interpreter 1234. What you would do is you would, and I do a terrible job, you would add me to that internal blacklist and say, okay, if you ever get Canon interpreter 1234, just hang up, call LanguageLine back and request a different interpreter. But in addition to that, who's ever responsible for the contract would then contact LanguageLine and say, hey, Canon is terrible. You cannot assign him to our contract again. So same process if you have work with a company that for in-person interpretation, whatever, you want to track that, make sure that internally people are aware of your bad interpreters and the company is aware of any issues that you may have. In addition to that, you want to create a list of your good interpreters, whether that's telephonic, video, or in person, and share that list internally so that when you have time, you can request those interpreters specifically, right? If you have a contract with agencies, you can also say, hey, Mia is an incredible interpreter. We would actually prefer to have her assigned to our contracts when she's available, right? So you can contract wise, you can create a process to ensure that the interpreters that you get that are qualified are coming to your contract. So Mia, could you go over the second question?
Yes, it's similar. It's how would you handle it if you believe the interpreter was not relaying accurate or all information in the moment? And then we have a similar question in the chat. What do you do on the spot when the interpretation is not correct?
Sure. And so what you can do is, I mean, you want to assess how serious you believe the mistake is, right? Is it just a minor issue, or do you feel like it's substantial? Generally, the practice recommendation is to stop the interpretation and say, and clarify with the interpreter, right? And when this conversation is happening, the qualified interpreter won't just be communicating to you, they'll still be interpreting to the LEP individual so that the LEP individual understands what's going on, right? So what you'll want to do is, hey, so Mia's telling me, hey, Cannon, I just want to check in because it sounds like I speak a little Spanish and you interpreted this, and I don't believe that's an accurate interpretation. Now, the good interpreter will either say, oh, clarify and explain, oh, the reason why I used it in this way is because Spanish that's spoken in Venezuela, this is how they say it, versus Spanish that's spoken in Spain, or Spanish that's spoken, or Puerto Rican Spanish. There are variations in the language, and so the interpreter may understand that and explain, okay, this is why I use this. Or in turn, the interpreter say, you know what, you're right, I did make a mistake, I'll make the correction. Or but if you raise the issue and they can't give you an explanation that you like, you want to flag that as an issue. And depending on the situation you're in, if you're in court, depending on the court process, you'll want it to address the issue to the judge, whether you're going through the clerk or the bailiff, or directly addressing the judge, identify the language issue and getting it on the record, and then following up on the process. But whatever you can do, you want to address the issue when it happens, and see if the explanation is appropriate, right? If you don't like the explanation, then you need to figure out how to get a new interpreter in. Right. And so, but it's all context based also, right? So if you're in court, there's going to be a process you follow. If you're interviewing a client and you have an in-person interpreter or a telephonic interpreter, let's use the telephonic as an example. You're interviewing your client, they've come into the office, and you don't, the telephonic interpreter is off. And what I will say is always go with your gut. You all have so much experience and knowledge, and if something feels off, there's a reason why it feels off. So go with your gut and ask. And if they can't give an explanation that you like, then you get a new interpreter, right? And you follow the process to do that. And so we do a whole training on how to hang up on your telephonic interpreter, right? Like it isn't a natural for a lot of people. If you're like me, I have trouble hanging up on telemarketers because I feel bad, because I think, well, they're just doing their job, right? And I don't know how to hang up. It's something that you have to practice. And so one of the things that we help the agencies do is develop a script for their staff if they need to bring in another interpreter. And it's just as simple as, I need to make some copies. So I'm going to hang up on the interpreter. So I'm talking to the LEP individual through the interpreter. I need to make some copies, so I'm going to hang up on the interpreter, and I will get another interpreter when I'm back from making the copies. Right? So that way, we're not saying something to upset the interpreter, where then the interpreter could potentially say something that impacts our client, right? The interpreter is none the wiser, right? We hang up, call language line, say, hey, Mia, yeah, Canon was crap. You need to get me another interpreter, right? And that's how you would handle it. Mia, was there another question or comment?
Well, first, I couldn't imagine saying the sentence canon is crap or was crap, but I wanted to flag for you. It's 1:55. And
Sure.
so there's more questions, but I figured if you want to get to anything important, and then we'll go back to Q&A.
Sure. Thank you for that.
Mhm.
Mia knows I like to talk a lot. So, so I'm gonna just go over language access planning very quickly, and the inclusion of all the materials is based on the Department of Justice guidance, right? So convening, assessing, collaborating, setting objectives, timeframes, who will implement, funding, formalizing the plan, implementing the plan, training, outreach, and monitoring. So I'm going to go over these pretty quickly. These slides are here for you as a resource. There are also a lot of great resources from the Department of Justice and other agencies on creating a language access plan. And if you're interested, I also have sample language access plans that have been shared with me in the past. That so you know, if you're interested, just let me know what kind of services you provide, and I can see if I've got sample plans that are closely match the types of services you're providing. So pre-work, what I will highlight, don't do this by yourself, right? Work with other people within your agency. A lot of times I find, you know, people come to me and it's just the one person in the agency that's really interested and really wants to get it done. And they talk to their boss and the boss says, yeah, go ahead and do it, right? It's so hard to do by yourself. So, you know, collaborating with other people within your agency, making sure that the your agency includes the different points of contact that victims may encounter. Language spoken in your service area, make sure you're not just looking at the census, right? We want to make sure that we're collecting information. So don't rely just on the census. The census is so limited, right? I mean, one of the challenges we have for the census is that it identifies Chinese as a language. So what does that mean for us language access planning? Is that Mandarin? Is that Cantonese? Are you doing simplified Chinese or traditional Chinese for translation? So there are limitations. Also, it doesn't capture the transient population. So we've got a lot of transient workforce, undocumented workforce, but also we have a lot of international students and tourists, right? How are we capturing all that information? So look for other resources, government, school districts, colleges, universities, tribal communities, ask law enforcement, courts, hospitals, just identify different resources for you to collect that information. Looking to each other, asking OVS, hey, what are some of the language requests that we should be considering, or language populations? We're getting a lot of refugees from Afghanistan and Ukraine. That information isn't going to be captured. They're not going to capture information on Dari, Pashto, or Ukrainian right now. Indigenous languages spoken in Mexico, Central and South America, that data is not going to be captured, right? So but they're in our communities, so we want to be prepared should they need assistance to be able to provide that meaningful access to them. The first thing you want to do is take a look at what you're doing around language access. So, you know, if you've got a plan, taking a look at your plan. If you don't have a plan, you're doing something, right? So saying, and even if it's just relying on language line, that's part of your plan, and writing that down. And based off of that, you know, on your current practices, then we can start talking about what you can do to improve your language access plan and making sure that your plan is actually has that trauma-informed lens. Always ask your staff and your clients to see, well, how good a job are we doing with our language access? You know, your staff are going to be really important, particularly the staff that you're leaning on. When I worked for a legal services agency, our receptionist was our interpreter, right? And you know, she would have said, we're not doing a great job, right? So making sure you're asking all of the key stakeholders about how your current practices. Some of the options and some of the things to consider is hiring bilingual, bicultural staff. Just really quick, this is not part of the training, but language and culture is intertwined. So we want to make sure that you're not just looking for somebody that speaks the language, but speaks the language and understands the culture of the population that you're intending to serve. Hiring interpreters, contracting with a telephonic interpretation line. So really quick, language line is a company. So if you type that into Google, that's what you're going to get. So if you're searching for a company, there are a lot of companies that do telephonic interpretation. You type in telephonic interpretation, or you call me and ask me, hey, what are some companies I should be looking at? One of the things that, if possible, is offering, if you're working with interpreters on a regular basis, offering them training, not just on being trauma informed, but on the types of cases and the types of clients that you're seeing, you know, so subject specific. So if you're if the services you provide cover the whole range of victims of crime, offering that up, or recommending that they identify trainings available to them in those areas. Allocating and building resources. Make sure you're budgeting. Whoever's responsible for the budget, whenever you submit a grant proposal, including a line item for interpretation and translation of resources, right? Even if you don't end up using that, I mean, you can always repurpose that for other funding, for other needs, but making sure that you're including that. I include this because I've worked with a lot of agencies that have a process but haven't written it down, and what ends up happening is when the person responsible for the process leaves the agency, the whole plan is gone. So making sure that you write it down so that me as a new employee or me as an employee for 5 or 10 years, I can just pick it up and I know how to get access to the services I need. Let's see. In terms of implementation, you want to make sure you're identifying a staff position or several staff positions responsible for the language access plan, and you include that position in the language access plan so people know. And the reason why I say staff position is you don't want a named person. Like it shouldn't be Mia is responsible for the language access plan, right? Because if Mia leaves, and it's not part of her job responsibility, named and listed job responsibility, then what happens is the language access plan gets lost, right? You hire a new person, they don't realize they're supposed to be in charge of the language access plan, and then all the work and effort that you've put into it kind of gets put to the side. So it should be tied to a position, whether that's your administrative manager, whether that's a senior staff member, whether that's the CEO or your HR person, whoever it is, you tie it to the position so that you have continuity should there be changes in your staff. Training is key. I do a lot of training on this in terms of understanding what their responsibilities are around language access, how to effectively work with interpreters, right? And understanding what their legal obligations are. So whether that's for new staff that you're onboarding, or it's a refresher training for the staff that are have already that are working for your agency. Community outreach, it's really important, and our understanding of what you should be doing in outreach has also evolved, right? So back in the day when I was practicing law, it was like, well, if you build it, they will come, right? And what we've learned is if you build it, they won't come, right? Just because I'm the lawyer and I have funding and I'm here ready to take your case doesn't necessarily mean that the people in the community I'm actually supposed to be helping are going to come to me. So you want to be inclusive. You want to make sure that you're going out into the community, finding those people, those trusted people. And I will say, when I say trusted people, not just the people that say, oh yeah, hey, I'm Cannon. If you want to talk to the Korean people in the community, just come to me, right? There's a power and control dynamic there, particularly as it relates to limited English proficient communities, right? The people that speak English, they're professionals, but also to a certain extent, they are exercising power and control because they speak English. Right. And unfortunately, we have encountered situations where those people who put themselves forward as the community liaison aren't necessarily there because they want to help the community. They may be there because there's a financial incentive, but they might also be there because they are exercising power over that community, right? So you want to make sure, I think some of the best people to talk to are the kids, right? High schoolers, college students, and just say, hey, who in the community is the point of contact? And it could actually be, the college student or the high schooler, right? But they may be able to point you to the right people who will help you gain access so that then the communities that you're trying to do outreach and trying to help are you're finding the right people to talk to so that people are listening to how you're able to help them. Finally, monitoring and compliance. You want to make sure you're tracking your language access plan, right? And so whether it's changes in your demographics, but this is also where you're going to be tracking the quality of interpretation. So, checking in, if you're working with an interpretation company or a translation company, let's go with translation, and you've submitted translations for them to translate, and over the past year, there have been multiple complaints about the accuracy of the translation. At this point, when you're monitoring, you're going to go, okay, well, there have been a number of complaints and they haven't been able to address it, or they've fixed it, but they keep making the same types of mistakes. Let's reassess and let's see if we can find another translation company. So you want that process in place, both to assess for how well your plan is working, but identify some of the issues that you could be having. I'm a visual person, so I like this. And so this is from the Department of Justice on language access, and it kind of highlights all the different things that you want included in your language access plan. Once again, these resources are available online. I'm happy to share them with you. Also, if you're interested. So translations, once again, translation is written. Programs should provide translation of vital written materials into languages of each frequently encountered LEP group eligible to be served or likely to be affected by the recipient's program. So that's Title VI. So when the vital documents, so documents related to the service provided, including but not limited to notice of rights, intake and application forms, consent and complaint forms, notices of denials, losses, or decreases of benefits. So you'll want to make sure that if you are communicating any information that has legal implications, that you are translating those vital documents. If it's a language you don't frequently encounter, generally the practice that is used is that it is an English document, but you have an interpreter sight translate that document for your client. So we talked about technology. So video remote interpreting is something that we're encountering more, where agencies are using video to interpret. We saw that a lot with American Sign Language. Now we're seeing it with spoken language. Video relay service is what replaced TTY phones, right? So video relay service is for individuals who are deaf, and it's a phone service. So you cannot use video relay service to interpret for a client that you're meeting in person. That's only over the phone. CART technology, so captioning technology, is going to be used with somebody that is deaf or hard of hearing who doesn't know sign language, and that might be their preferred mode. And we talked about Google Translate and other real-time machine translation. So really quick, some resources I wanted to share with you. So I love this. This was from an agency in Texas that shared this with us. It's an iSpeak card. It's something that they were giving to clients, which helps the client assert their right to language access under Title VI. But what I loved about this is on the back, they put a contact number for the advocate. So if your client is advocating for their language access rights and anybody has any questions, they can turn over the card and point to the advocate and have them contact the advocate to clarify what the obligation is under Title VI. Just sharing some of we have translated materials in multiple languages. So brochures, consent forms, different types of information on the different forms of gender-based violence. I wanted to share this with you. It's a great resource. The first time a colleague of mine shared it with me, they told me, hey, check out Hot Peach Pages. And I thought they were messing with me. I was like, oh, you're trying to get me in trouble because it doesn't sound quite right, right? But it's an incredible resource. So it's a clearinghouse of information that's been translated on sexual and domestic violence from around the world, right? And so just an example of some of the languages and the materials that they have. So it's an incredible resource. Just some additional resources. And with that, I'll open it up to questions.
We have one in the Q&A that's related to something you just mentioned with the brochures.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a recommendation for going about printing brochures or reading material on a program? If you can only produce 2 or 3 language versions of something, what languages would you recommend?
So what you'll want to be doing is looking at your service area and identifying what the greatest need is, right? So in general, in terms of if your service area has a largely Spanish-speaking population, and there isn't information on what you're intending to include in the brochure, right? Then what I would say is, okay, well, look at population, look at the highest need, and defining need as the greatest population that doesn't have that resource. But let's say that there are multiple service agencies, Spanish-speaking service agencies. So we'll say protection order, right? Restraining or protection order. Let's say you've got a brochure on what a protection order is, right? And then you look, and obviously Spanish is going to be the highest population need, but there are multiple service agencies that have already translated materials on protection orders. So then I would look at, okay, well, what's the next population group? And then, oh, okay, this is the population group. And let's say it's Ukrainian, because you just had an influx of Ukrainian refugees coming in. And you say, okay, well, we got Ukrainian and we know there's not information on that. So we will be translating that. And so contracting with an agency to translate that, but then also working to ensure that you have some of the local people that read Ukrainian to review the translations. We actually worked with a couple of agencies, and they contract with a large translation company, and what ended up happening, what they got back when they did when they published that material to the public, they started getting feedback, and what the feedback they got was, yeah, the translation isn't quite accurate and it doesn't have as much meaning to us because the translation is off. And what happened is the translation company was translating Spanish from Spain and not actually the local. I believe it was predominantly, I believe it was Mexican Spanish that was spoken in the area. And so there was a disconnect in the translation, so it wasn't effective. So you would want to build in a process to have that reviewed. And then what you would do is if there were issues, you would go back to the translation company and have that corrected. I hope I answered your question.
Aiden, who posed that question, said, "Thank you so much, Canon. I could tell you're extremely experienced. The translated material will come in handy."
I've messed up enough times, so you just ask me. I've messed it up so many times that you can learn from all of my mistakes. Just one of the things I want to highlight is language is constantly evolving, right? And so I apologize if I trigger anybody, but how we say things and how they're said has an impact, and our interpreters need to be able to convey that meaning. And so one of the examples that was shared with me was in a criminal case, the interpreter was uncomfortable with the term fucked. And so what the suspect says is, yeah, I fucked her. And what the interpreter said is, yeah, we made love, right? Two totally different meanings. Our interpreters have to understand that, right? And they need to be able to convey that meaning. So when we're doing that quick check with our interpreters, right, we're just meeting with the interpreter and we know it involves language that is somebody might have discomfort with, is to ask them, hey, how would you interpret fucked? And if they can't do it, that creates an issue. Another example I want to share is, so I use it as an example that was shared with me is papaya. If I say papaya, how many of you think fruit? I think fruit, right? But in some Spanish-speaking countries, papaya is slang for pussy. If your interpreter isn't able to interpret that and doesn't understand the context, it changes what you're looking at, right? So if there was a report that somebody was walking around the playground asking kids, hey, what's your favorite fruit, right? And oh, your favorite fruit is apples. Well, I love papaya. If you don't understand what papaya means, you are not able to identify that a crime has been committed or what type of crime, right? These are the types of things that we want to make sure that you're including in that quick assessment of your interpreters, whether you're meeting them and you've got 30 seconds, right? Or you have time and you have a client meeting next week and you can contact your interpretation company and clarify with them, okay, this is the community that they're working with. This is the context in which we are having this interview. Is the interpreter familiar with and able to interpret this Spanish from this community, from this country, from this community, from this region, right? Another thing we encourage you to do is to develop glossaries, right? To identify slang glossaries, that identify slang, commonly used terms for the communities that you're serving, and to share those with the interpreters whenever possible. Okay, Mia, I think you had another question.
We do. We have when generating a police report, omission of facts may be omitted. Can the victim be allowed to update the report at a later time?
That is something specific to New York that Mia, I think, is a TA request.
I think so too.
Yeah, and I would hope that the victim could make corrections, but I've been in some states where victim rights weren't prioritized, so I don't want to misstate anything.
Catherine, feel free to email me. I'll message you my email and we can find another time to talk with someone who may know. We also have from Ilya, how can we request the cards for our agency? And I think she's referring to the rights cards that you showed.
Yeah. So I'm happy to share the PDF file and then you can print them up yourselves. So I'll share the PDF file with Mia, and then Mia, you can share it with the attendees.
Right. We also have questions about the difference between translation and interpretation. Are there any resources that explain that?
Sure. We have resources, and I'll share additional resources. So if you go to the American Translators Association, so it's ATA. That's the translation, and so they'll have resources that explain what translation is or what interpretation is. You can also go to lep.gov. That is the clearinghouse for federal agencies on language access, so they'll have explanations between the difference between interpretation and translation. The National Association of Judiciary Interpreters and Translators, so NAJIT, they'll also have information on interpretation and translation. And Mia, just email me and I'll send all the links that I've referred to, and we can get those out to everybody.
That sounds good. We've got one more question in Q&A, but we have time. So anyone, if
Okay.
you want to add questions to the chat, or if Cannon, you have another like talking point you want to go into. But before then, we have a question from Jose. What if we use AI, since this has become enhanced all around?
AI just isn't at a point where I would be comfortable saying that it's accurate enough for us, right? And so when we're talking about the context of working with victims and survivors, it's not there yet. In addition to that, it's not recognized by the Department of Justice as meaningful access, so you wouldn't be in compliance if you relied on AI. I also have privacy concerns related to AI because, it's a learning software, so it's saving information. Does that mean no? I think that you can use it to the extent where you're not concerned about accuracy and you're not concerned about privilege or confidentiality. It's a learning software. I'm hoping at some point, and that's the direction that technology is going. And at some point, we're going to reach the point where the technology is accurate enough and they've addressed the confidentiality and privacy concerns that we would have in working with victims, where it would be at a place where I would say, yeah, you can use it, but right now it's just not there yet. So if you're using it or you have to rely on it, just understand the potential limitations of that and the potential confidentiality concerns that arise.
Thanks, Cannon. We have another question related to confidentiality, saying, I observe some programs falling back and using family members to translate. I worry about confidentiality and safety. How do you address this?
Sure. Our recommendation is that you don't use family members. First of all, there's a bias there. It could be an instance where the family member has an interest in making sure that information isn't fully provided. So we see this a lot where it's oh, hey, my sister wants to, I'm the sister, I'm going to interpret, right? And then what ends up happening is actually not their sister, but the sister of the perpetrator, right? So there's those biases can come up. Also, in addition to that, there is a potential where the client isn't willing to disclose all the information they need to because they don't want the family member to know what's happening, right? And so the challenge with this is, well, first of all, LAP individuals, they're used to not getting language access. So they're used to being told, bring a family member, right? So and they believe they can't get any kind of help unless they provide language access themselves, right? But what the law says is that it's the agency's responsibility, whoever's receiving the federal funds. And so the practice should be is that they should be offering the interpreter and explaining to the LEP individual, you have a right to interpreter at no cost, and I actually need the interpreter. And it's great that your family member is here, but your family member isn't a trained interpreter, right? And I need to make sure that I'm getting all the information accurately from you so I know how best to help you and provide you with all the options that you have. So building that into practice, right? Because the issue is you have potential bias, conflicts of interest. The family member is most likely not a trained interpreter, so you're going to have an accuracy issue. People who aren't trained interpreters, who aren't practicing the skill on a regular basis, what they end up doing is summarizing, right? And so they are picking what information you get to hear, and they're basing it on what they think is important, right? For us, we need all the information. You don't need me to decide what's important for you, right? And once again, accuracy is what's important. So you want to make sure that the agencies that you're working with aren't leaning on the family members and putting into their process, having a language access plan where they're offering an interpreter and making it clear to the LEP individual that it's not that I don't want your family member there. It's that in order to make sure that I get all the accurate information, that I understand and hear everything that you're trying to tell me, I need that qualified interpreter. And it's a process, right? So if you're seeing that with agencies, it's a training issue, both in terms of Title VI compliance, but it's also making sure that they actually have a language access plan that isn't leaning on family members.
We have a question in the chat about resources for printable materials that are more region specific in a language.
So, so Hot Peach Pages is a great resource, right? Depending on where you're located, I would say just reach out to us and let us know what language, region, and community you're talking about, and we can see if there's anything that exists to provide you as a resource. Some of them are just going to be really tricky, like Mixteco is really hard, right? And what we understand and what I've learned is that how you translate something into Mixteco, first, I don't believe it's a written language. I think that they've tried to make it phonetic, right? And so they've taken Spanish and they try to phoneticize Mixteco, right? But you know, it's to the extent where the language and the variations in the language, depending on the language, could differ from village to village, right? So so Hot Peach Pages, if you're talking about Spanish, Esperanza is a great resource. LEP.gov will have some links to resources, but if you've got a specific language in mind, you know, reach out to us and we can see what resources we have available to you. Were there any other questions?
Yeah, I was going to ask the same. If there's any more questions, feel free to add them to the chat or the Q&A. In the meantime, I'll flag my comment in the chat about the post-webinar evaluation. We put the link in the chat. We encourage you to fill it out. It really only takes a few minutes. And your feedback from the evaluation allows us to keep improving the webinar series. So please get to that if you can. And again, send any more questions our way. I think I just saw one from David. I'm curious, what are alternatives for a deaf victim who does not use ASL?
So if you have a deaf victim who doesn't use ASL, there are people who are called certified deaf interpreters. These are deaf individuals who have specific training on interpreting with deaf individuals who don't know a formal sign language. So that's certified deaf interpreters. You can, if you go to Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, RID.org, they will have a list, and there are not very many certified deaf interpreters, but interpreters who are able to, deaf interpreters who are able to interpret for individuals who do not know a formal sign language. There is a limitation in that is assuming that the deaf individual grew up in the United States, right? And is part of the, understand the deaf culture and community. If you are talking about somebody who is deaf and from, Mexico or India or, Ukraine, right? Venezuela, the best resource you have in that instance, and what you're looking at essentially is somebody that can help you with the home signing. You'll want to try to contact the embassy to see if they have some resources. But in turn, if you are facing challenges, finding an interpreter to assist you with somebody who is deaf, who doesn't know a form of sign language, just please feel free to reach out to me, and I'll reach out to my network and we'll see what we can find for you.
Thank you, Cannon. We have here on the slide our evaluation link. We also just wanted to share, just thank you for joining us. We offered this webinar to you again through TARP, and we have another one coming up about healing in crisis. It's about working with those frontline workers, as well as survivors of trauma. So thank you all for joining us. Thank you for your evaluation results, and thank you most of all to Cannon for a really wonderful webinar. It's been a real pleasure to hear your expertise. And for everyone who participated with your questions, it was a really lively webinar, which we love seeing. Rachel, did I miss anything? Anything you wanted to add?
I don't think so. I would just say complete that evaluation. And if you're an OVS funded program and you need some training, talk to your program directors so that you can submit a TARP request. We can really build things that are specific to what your program needs. So definitely can continue the conversation through one of those personalized programs.
Thanks, everyone. And once again, you're not alone in this. There are a lot of resources. A lot of different agencies are working on it. And my job is to help you with language access. And if you don't ask, I sit here and play with my hair. And I do love to play with my hair. But I think Rachel and Mia also think I should be more constructive with my time. So, please feel free to reach out to us. If you have any questions, whether it's language access planning, whether it's offering training to your staff on how to work with interpreters, or finding good interpreters and translators, please feel free to reach out.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all.